this SMSL has something that no other mid-range DAC I've encountered so far has. Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Now what we have here today is, yes, yet another SMSL mid-range DAC. But wait a moment before you just shrug your shoulders and say like, what's new? Another day, another SMSL DAC. Because this one is different. I'll get to that in a moment. Why is it different? And why should you consider buying it instead of anything else on the market at the moment? Then I'll do a few comparisons, as I always do, and in the end I'll tell you the reasons why you should buy this DAC or why you maybe shouldn't. So let's start with the most interesting thing about SMSL D300 probably, and that is its DAC chip. Because this one is made by a company that we do not encounter that often, and it's called, I'll just pronounce it R-Ohm, because of the origin of the name of that company. R stands for resistance and ohm stands for, well, ohm. And in my opinion that is quite refreshing in the market dominated by Sabre and AK. And maybe sometimes like Texas Instruments, Burr Brown, but I have never before encountered an R-Ohm DAC chip. And this SMSL D300 is based on it. Of course, a DAC is not its chip. I always want to emphasize that because chip is only part of a story. How you put it in use and create circuitry around it and analog section and digital filtering and so on influences the end result a lot, quite often even more than a DAC chip itself. But before we get to the sound quality part, I'll just quickly go through connectivity and features. So on the back, you can see it's a pretty straightforward, as with most mid-range DACs. And if I didn't mention it already, D300 costs $400 US. So on the back we can find 3 digital inputs, meaning very usual USB, optical, and coaxial SPDIF. Also, you have Bluetooth antenna, so you have wireless connectivity. A lot of you often ask me in the comments, like, how is Bluetooth done? Do I lose any sound quality over these wired digital inputs? And the only reason I don't pay much attention to Bluetooth in these reviews is because it's always a little bit lossy. So Bluetooth is always an input of convenience and not of a quality. And you can only hear 100% of what your DAC has to offer once you actually connect it with a cable, that being USB or optical or coaxial. And when it comes to analog outputs, we have a set of RCA, single-ended outs, as well as a set of XLR, those are balanced outputs. And as you can see from this power inlet, power supply is actually located inside of the unit, so you only need a cord like this one and you're ready to go. And with that, let me quickly turn it on and show you some things about this DAC. So in the front here, we have this newly designed knob that has quite a bit of clicky quality to it, and it's quite nice. It's flat this time, it doesn't protrude like this older knob, but it has this rest for your finger and I guess it's quite easy to use. And then menus are typical SMSL, you can browse through several features. But interesting thing here is that this DAC is actually not as rich with features as most SMSL DACs lately. For example, if we are talking about digital filters, here you can choose between 2 of them. One being slow roll-off and fast roll-off. That's it. If you're used to tone color function that some SMSL DACs are offering, like rich crystal, tube, and things like that, you don't find that here. I'm not sure if it's because of a DAC chip or what's happening, but SMSL definitely dialed back when it comes to options that you can tinker with. That said, you can still adjust the brightness of the screen, and you can set display to turn off automatically after some time when you're not using options or anything on the DAC. And that's always a great feature to have, in my opinion. Lastly, you can set outputs to be fixed in level, meaning around 2 volts on single-ended out and around 4 volts on balanced outputs, or you can engage preamp mode, meaning that you have volume attenuation in this DAC, and you can basically use it as a small, simple preamp. And just as it was with SMSL SU9N that I reviewed recently, here you also get this new redesigned remote control. And I feel it's a little bit nicer than the old one. It has more of a clicky feeling and good feedback when buttons are pressed. And this is probably going to be a default remote for all new SMS products going forward. But all of that aside, how does D300 sound? And well, that's the interesting part. It sounds different. Different than most SMSL DACs and different than most DACs in this price range from any manufacturer. So let me try to explain this. D300 sounds a little bit warmer and softer than most Delta Sigma DACs. And in general, it reminds me a little bit on a Schiit Modim Multibit DAC. That's the DAC that I reviewed like a year and some time ago, maybe a year and a half. I really liked it because of its full and palpable mid-range, rich tone timbre, and it wasn't the latest and greatest when it comes to being highly detailed and resolving, but it had something that just made me prefer it for like longer listening to most DACs on the market at that moment. And D300 is not exactly the same as Schiit Modim Multibit, but it's quite close tonally. And I would say it's probably closer to it than to most Sabre and AK DACs on the market at the moment. So D300 offers you that slightly warmish, rich sounding tonality with full mid-range and slightly softer edges. Also slightly rolled off treble response. Maybe it's not that rolled off, but it's not exactly as bright and as sharp and as focused as with many other DACs. And depending on you and your personal preferences and your system, that can be like a good thing or not so good thing. But there is definitely some sort of natural feel to the sound of D300. So play some vocals through D300, for example female vocals, and you'll hear that they sound quite natural and smooth. But there is also a really reasonable amount of texture coming from those vocals. Anything that sounds remotely annoying or sharp or digital or clawy, like sibilant, it's never a problem through D300. Everything is on this sort of mild, softer, natural side of things. And when it comes to details, this DAC retrieves a lot of things happening in the recording. But again, it does that in a sort of milder and softer manner. If you want a most precise tool that will let you know the exact spot where a string was plucked, and to hear the sharpest, cleanest edge of that string, this is not that DAC. It will make that sound, again, quite full, lush and airy, but it will present everything with a touch of warmth and touch of lushness and softness to it. And I suppose that's a welcome change for a Delta Sigma DAC at this price point, because it seems to me that a lot of listeners actually prefer that kind of tuning. It's really relaxing, especially for a longer listening sessions, And I suppose that is something that some of you would call like analog sounding. Because this DAC avoids sounding overly sharp, edgy, and it never feels like it's etching edges of the instruments. There's always like a nice full body of the instrument. There's a lot of texture from inside the tone that you can hear, but it does not focus on these edges. Bass line is quite decent. It's reasonably deep, but it's not the deepest one that you'll hear, and it's also not the most punchy and slammy bass line that again you'll hear. If you want that, something like SU9 or SU9N will bring you more beat, more slam. And it will sound more focused, with more bite. But this one will definitely sound a little bit more analog and soft and more natural. And also SU9, SU9N, 8S will offer more upper mid-range bite and higher frequency extension and clarity. But on the other hand, D300 here sounds kinda effortless and softer and more natural. It's just difficult to describe it any other way. But in doing that, it is softer on the edges. It is a little bit hazier, maybe less defined. And I guess that I've already entered into comparisons without announcing it. So if you want something more focused, more slammy with cleaner and crisper edges, SMSL SU9, SU9N, SU8S are those. Also, Topping D30 is one of those DACs. If you want something softer, something more natural, a little bit fuller, and just milder in tonality, SMSL D300 is a thing. And that actually leads me to comparison to Topping D30 Pro, because this one has few similarities with D300. They both have this sort of slightly more laid back, softer, milder, and I guess you can even call it a little bit darker presentation. And when you compare them directly, D30 Pro offers a little bit more grunt and emphasis on the bass. D300 is a little bit lighter on its feet, a little bit quicker, but both are pretty good. In terms of both mid-range and higher frequencies, I don't hear much difference there. Both have this slightly softer, slightly milder presentation that's not edgy and not as crisp as some other DACs, but sounds quite natural and easy on the ears. The biggest difference between these two, in my opinion, is sound staging. D300 sounds to me and to my ears a little bit wider. It extends more towards speakers, left and right, and maybe a little bit around them, but it's not as deep. It's a little bit more of wall of sound presentation, but that wall is really big and high and spacious, and everything is well separated on it. While, as I mentioned, D30 is kind of narrower, it creates that smaller in between your speakers sound, but it feels like it can go a little bit deeper and put some things in the soundstage deeper back behind your speakers. A difference is not huge, and I believe it's more of a matter of preference, but if you liked what you heard about Topping D30 Pro, now you have a similar DAC on the market coming from SMSL that sounds a little bit wider and a little bit lighter, quicker in the bass line, but maybe somewhat more mid-range centric. Things like vocals and similar mid-range tones are a little bit more forward, more open towards you, and I guess that some of you will prefer that. Now, I mentioned Schiit Modi Multibit in the beginning of this video, but unfortunately I sold that one like a year ago. I simply cannot keep everything I buy, but this one does remind me on Schiit Modi Multibit. Just going by my memory, I would say that Multibit still has a lower mid-range emphasis. It creates bolder sound there, maybe even a little bit more colored than SMSL D300, making everything sound even like fuller and lusher and chestier, and also maybe more palpable in space, like, oh, here's vocal, I can touch it. But from what I can remember, I would say the D300 creates somewhat wider and airier soundstage that's not as dense as with Multibit, but it is kind of more relaxed, a little bit wider. And it also comes with balanced outputs and a remote control, preamp function if you need that. So it definitely presents a pretty good alternative to those of you who like that sort of sound but live outside of the US, because Schiit products are much more expensive anywhere in the world than in the US. For example, that Multibit costs $250 in the US, but in Europe it's 300 and something euros, and that's even before the taxes. So it comes to a pretty similar pricing in the end to this SMSL. And as I mentioned, this one offers balanced outputs, a little bit more features, remote, preamp functionality, and so on and so on. So it is a pretty decent alternative to anybody liking that kind of sound signature, but not living in the US and not having Schiit readily available. And with that said, it's time to end this video, but I can say that I'm really glad that some other DAC chips are coming on the market, are becoming common and used in these mainstream products, because diversity and choices are always good in my opinion. Yeah, if you like that sharper, focused kind of sound, you still have your Saber offerings, also from SMSL. But if you like this sort of milder, softer, kind of more natural analog presentation, now you have one DAC more to choose from. And that would be it. Thank you for watching, guys. If you liked the video, then click that button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon so you can get notification when new reviews are released. And finally, consider becoming a patron too, because that really helps the channel. And huge thanks to all current patrons. See you next time. Bye.